My final summation, as I estimate it now, should take between 2 and 2.5 days.
Keep this in mind, ladies and gentlemen, that murders as extremely bizarre as these murders were, almost by definition are not going to have a simple, common, everyday type of motive. Just imagining the incredible barbarism and senselessness of these murders would lead one to conclude that the person who masterminded them had a wild, twisted, bizarre reason for ordering them. The evidence at this trial shows that Charles Manson is that person who had that motive, and the trial showed what that motive was. I, as a pro-second suitor, and you folks as members of the jury, cannot help it. We cannot help it if Manson had this wild, crazy idea about helter-skelter. It is not our fault. Manson is the one that made the evidence, not we. We can only deal with the evidence that presents itself. That evidence was that he wanted to start this black-white war in the streets. That is what the evidence was that came from that witness stand. On the very day of the Tate murders, a matter of hours before these 5 murders, Linda Kasabian testified that Manson said, "Now is the time for helter-skelter." Of course, he then gives Linda the wallet and tells her to hide the wallet, and says, "I hope a black person finds it and uses the credit cards," thereby leading the white community to believe that black people had committed these murders. On the refrigerator door at the La Bianca residence we find the words, "Helter-Skelter," printed in blood. We know the killers printed those words, "Rise," and "Death to Pigs," printed in blood on the living room wall of the La Bianca residence. War was carved on Lena's stomach. Rise, death to pigs, where all of these terms are tied in with Manson's fanatical obsession with helter-skelter. The family at Spawn Ranch was Charlie Manson's family, ladies and gentlemen. He controlled every single facet of their daily existence. Manson and the family used the term helter-skelter constantly. It was an everyday word with them. Even a song composed by Charles Manson had the words helter-skelter in there. The song, Helter Skelter, as recorded by the Beatles, was played over and over again by Manson and the family. When these defendants and Charles Tex Watson printed the word pig at the Tate residence and the words "Death to Pigs," "Rise," and "Helter Skelter," and "War" at the La Bianca residence, instead of those words, ladies and gentlemen, they may just as well have printed the name Charles Manson. It is that obvious. Those words and Charles Manson are synonymous. The prosecution at this trial put on some very, very powerful evidence of motive. All of it unerringly and irresistibly pointed in one direction, toward these defendants, and particularly Charles Manson, and His Honor will instruct you that you may consider evidence of motive. You may consider motive evidence as evidence of the guilt of these defendants. Very briefly summarizing the main and principal items of evidence against each defendant, including co-conspirator, Tex Watson, and without repeating many other items of evidence that I have already gone over, these are the highlights against each particular defendant. Against Watson, co-conspirator in count number 8 of the indictment, in addition to Linda Kasabian's testimony, which, of course, proves that Watson was one of the Tate and the La Bianca killers. We have his fingerprints found at the scene. This is conclusive proof that he was one of the Tate killers. Now, since Watson was a member of the family living with Manson and the others at Spawn Ranch, and since Linda Kasabian testified that Watson was at the Tate residence on the night of the Tate murders, murdering the people with Katie and Sadie, and since his fingerprints were found at the scene, evidence proving that Watson was at the scene can be used by you as circumstantial evidence against his co-conspirators. In other words, these defendants. The fact that Watson was at the scene is circumstantial evidence against his co-conspirators, these defendants. Against Krenwinkel, and I am omitting many peripheral items of evidence against all of these defendants. I am just giving you the main ones against Krenwinkel, in addition to Linda's testimony, which proves beyond all doubt that Patricia Krenwinkel was one of the murderers at the Tate and La Bianca residences. Her fingerprint was found at the Tate residence, right inside Sharon Tate's bedroom. When you leave your fingerprints at the scene, ladies and gentlemen, you leave your calling card. You'll leave your calling card. It is positive, conclusive, scientific evidence. Susan Atkins, in addition to Linda's testimony, which clearly ties Miss Atkins and the Tate and LaBianca murders, confessed to 3 people of her involvement in the Tate murders. Leslie Van Houten. Of course, we have Linda Kasabian's testimony which irrevocably ties Miss Van Houten in with the LaBianca murders. In addition to that, Miss Van Houten confessed of her involvement in the LaBianca murders. The family that lived at Spawn Ranch in the very last analysis, was nothing more than a closely knit band of vagabond robots who were slavishly obedient to one man and one man only, their master, their leader, their god, Charles Manson. Within his domain, his authority and power were unlimited. He was the dictatorial Maharaja, if you will, of a tribe of boot-looking slaves who were only too happy to do his bidding for him. Charles Manson's family preached love but practiced cold-blooded, savage murder. Why was that so? Because Charles Manson, their boss, ordained it. If Manson had wanted his family to be singers in a church choir, that is what they would have been. On the other hand, if Charlie wanted the girls in his family to be streetwalkers and the boys to pimp for them, again, that is what they would have been. But churches and whorehouses, ladies and gentlemen, were not Charles Manson's business. Charlie's grip was violent death. And since that was his trip, we have these 7 Tate LaBianca murders. He controlled everything that they did on a day-to-day basis. He even controlled their sex lives. Manson's total and complete domination over his family, including the actual killers, Tex, Watson, Krenwinkel, Atkins, Leslie Van Houten, is extremely powerful circumstantial evidence that on the 2 nights in question he was also dominating them and directing everything that they did. He dominated Watkins, Atkins, Krenwinkel, and Van Houten before the Tate LaBianca murders, during the Tate LaBianca murders, and after the Tate LaBianca murders, right up until the time of the family's arrest in October of 1969 at Barker Ranch. There's a very powerful item of evidence, circumstantial evidence, that you may consider against Manson, Atkins, and Krenwinkel on the LaBianca murders, not on the Tate murders but on the LaBianca murders, and not against Van Houten, just Manson, Atkins, and Krenwinkel on the LaBianca murders. Now, remember we discussed during Wardire, we went over it ad nauseam, that from circumstantial evidence of one fact we infer the existence of another fact. Now, the testimony that I am referring to is this. It is rather clear, ladies and gentlemen, even without Linda Kasabian's testimony, in fact, without the testimony of any witnesses in this case, other than the testimony of the coroners, and the testimony of the officers who testified of their observations of the murder scene. Just by looking at their testimony without any other evidence, it is obvious, ladies and gentlemen, that the people who murdered the Tate victims also murdered Lino and Rosemary LaBianca. Now, I say this because of the very substantial and unique similarities between the Tate murders and the LaBianca murders. These murders happened on consecutive nights. Both murders apparently were committed in the depth of night. The Tate LaBianca victims were all Caucasians, and I think they would be considered or described to be members of the establishment. Certainly, Sharon Tate, Abigail Folger, and J. Sebring were rather prominent people. Mr. LaBianca was the chief stockholder in Gateway Markets. Getting into the murders themselves, the main murder weapon in both the Tate and LaBianca murders was a knife. Not only was the murder weapon a knife, ladies and gentlemen, but 4 out of the 5 of the Tate victims and Mr. and Mrs. LaBianca received a great number of stab wounds. The 5 Tate victims were stabbed 102 times. Mr. and Mrs. LaBianca were stabbed 67 times for a total of 169 stab wounds. In fact, the cause of death of 6 out of 7 of the Tate LaBianca victims was multiple stab wounds. This multiplicity of stab wounds certainly is a strong similarity between the Tate and the LaBianca murders, and somewhat related to what I just said. Both murders were marked by incredible savagery. There was a literal orgy of murder at both places. Also, both murders were marked by a lack and absence of a conventional motive. Neither the Tate nor the LaBianca residences had been ransacked, and many items of very valuable personal property were found all over the residence and had not been stolen. These were not murders committed to carry out any burglary or robbery. At the Tate residence, the killers placed a towel over J.C. Bring's head. That is kind of unusual, very unusual, and yet at the LaBianca residence Mr. and Mrs. LaBianca had pillowcases over their heads. Sharon Tate and J.C. Bring had ropes tied around their necks. Lino and Rosemary LaBianca had electrical cords tied around their necks. Perhaps the most unique and conclusive similarity between the Tate and the LaBianca murders is that not only did the killers print words in the victim's blood at the scene of both residences, which in and of itself was extremely unusual by itself, but some of the words they printed were the same. Pig, at the Tate residence. Death to pigs, at the LaBianca residence. Now, what is the legal relevance? What is the legal relevance of these similarities to you? The legal relevance is simply this. If you ladies and gentlemen of the jury believe beyond a reasonable doubt that Manson, Watson, Atkins, and Krenwinkel are the Tate killers, you are convinced of this fact, inasmuch as there are a remarkable number of unique similarities between the Tate murders and the LaBianca murders. The fact that Manson, Watson, Atkins, and Krenwinkel were the Tate killers is circumstantial evidence that they were also the LaBianca killers. When you go back to that jury room, you may consider this as circumstantial evidence against Manson, Atkins, and Krenwinkel on the LaBianca murders. Briefly discussing the rules of law under which these defendants are guilty of these murders, you will recall my earlier discussion, beginning with my opening argument regarding the law which you are going to be dealing with during your deliberations. All of these defendants are charged in count 8 of the indictment with the crime of conspiracy to commit murder. Conspiracy is nothing more than an agreement, getting together, agreeing to commit a crime, followed by an overt act to carry out the object of the conspiracy. Conspiracies can be and normally are proven by circumstantial evidence. In this case, we proved the conspiracy by direct evidence. Linda Kasabian, ladies and gentlemen, was present with these defendants and she told you everything that happened in her presence. To have a conspiracy, it is not necessary that the conspirators enter into any formal agreement. All that is necessary is that there be a meeting of the minds, that they be working together toward a common goal. There couldn't possibly be a more obvious conspiracy than this case, ladies and gentlemen. To say that on these 2 nights these defendants did not have a meeting of the minds and they were not working together toward the common goal would just be totally preposterous. The object of the conspiracy on both nights was murder, and these defendants, working together with deadly and savage precision, carried out that mission of murder by mercilessly cutting down their victims. All defendants are guilty of count 8 of the indictment, the count of conspiracy to commit murder. What about the first 7 counts of murder? What about those counts? Patricia Krenwinkel is guilty of all 7 counts of murder because it is obvious from the evidence that she was one of the actual killers of the Tate and LaBianca victims. Susan Atkins is guilty of the 5 Tate murders because she was one of the actual killers of the Tate victims. Leslie Van Houten is guilty of the 2 LaBianca murders because it is obvious from the evidence that she was one of the actual killers of Mr. and Mrs. LaBianca. Since Charles Manson was not one of the actual killers of the 7 victims, and since Susan Atkins was not one of the killers of Mr. and Mrs. LaBianca, under what rule of law are they guilty of these murders? Manson is guilty of all 7 counts of murder under the vicarious liability rule of conspiracy. It is also called the joint responsibility rule of conspiracy. And likewise, Susan Atkins is guilty of the 2 LaBianca murders because of the vicarious liability rule, the joint liability rule of conspiracy. The law is clear then that once a conspiracy is formed, each member of the conspiracy is criminally responsible for and equally guilty of crimes committed by his co-conspirators which were in furtherance of the object of the conspiracy. As I stated in my opening argument, if A and B conspired to murder X, and pursuant to that agreement B murders X, even though he was not the actual killer, is equally guilty of that murder. I don't care where he was, he could have been playing tennis, badminton, anywhere. He was a member of the conspiracy.